So Evan Thomas, Sandra Day O'Connor, Richard Nixon, Robert Kennedy, Edward Bennett Williams, John Paul Jones, Teddy Roosevelt. What's a thread that connects all these topics?
One of the great things about being a journalist, which I was by trade, is you can do anything you want. I mean, I'm not a scholar, I don't really have a specialty. Having said that, there is a connection. And I guess I would say it's America after World War II. This country really coming into its own as this global power, this supreme power, really. That fascinated me. And what's it like to be a leader in this world? It's your world, your time, your world. So that drew me initially to The Wise Men, which I did with Walter Isaacson. And then pretty much John Paul Jones, obviously, is a couple centuries before. But even he's a study in leadership. And I'm fascinated by the burdens of leadership because it's hard. It's harder than we think. And I'm fascinated by what it's like to be a man, and they were usually men. Obviously, Sandra Day O'Connor, in my last book, different story, but up to her, men. And human fallibility and human weakness dealing with these enormous pressures. How did they handle it? Well, some really well, and some bravely, and some not so well. But it's the pressure that interests me and how human beings respond to the pressure to be grandiose about this global leadership.
Well, let's go back to that first book with Walter Isaacson, came out in 1986, The Wise Men. Harriman, Kennan, Atchison, Bolin, etc. It seems, looking back now, that there was a coordination to their process and a coordination to their goal, and that it was a shared goal. Is that us just looking back in history?
No. I mean, I take your point. Historians, we're always doing this, looking back and imposing order on chaos, making, this era or that era, and actually it's just some years passing. So I take your point. But in this case, yes, actually, there was a shared worldview. And the worldview was, it is America's time. It is America's time. It had been Britain's, the 19th century was basically rural Britannia. Chaos in the early 20th century, but out of World War II, it's our time. And it's our time to do some good and honorable, decent, idealistic things, to bring democracy to the world. They were seriously idealistic about this. Now, it's also true that they were going to make money doing it. So you can't divorce these things. These are people from Wall Street, and they had made money by dealing with the world. So part of the global vision is free trade, a global community in which countries trade with each other, and America's going to do pretty well in that. And these people individually, that's not unfair. America's going to do well by this. So you can't divorce the money piece, but there's a lot of idealism in it. The third piece of it is power. In order to do all this, they have to have power, and they have to use power. How do you use power? When is it military power? When is it war? When is it diplomacy? When is it being smart enough to not go to war? Those are huge challenges which these men met pretty well initially. I mean, obviously, The Wise Men is a valedictory book, celebrating the world they made, because it, by and large, with some important exceptions, created decades of global peace, no world wars, global peace, and a system, a trading system that really benefited the United States, but also benefited Europe, which was rebuilt, Asia, Africa, the whole world. There are all these new books about how things are not as bad as you think. And because global standards of living have gone up, democracy has spread. It's receding right now, but it spread after World War II. So good things happened, not just to the United States, but to the whole world because of this system. Now, important exceptions. Vietnam was a disaster. Americans can be hubristic, and we make mistakes and we exploit people and we do bad things. Those are all true. But if you take the totality, the world got better.
Well, from that book, The Wise Men, you write that even the most careful scholars, in fact, particularly the most careful ones, sometimes seem to forget that at the midst of the momentous forces that shape the modern world were flesh and blood individuals acting on imperfect information and half-formed beliefs.
Well, isn't that life? I mean, certainly my life. And it's also the lives of the men who had to make these great decisions. You know, they didn't, for instance, what is Russia really up to? Russia was a closed society. The Soviet Union was a closed society. We like to think of James Bond. The United States, we didn't have any spies in Moscow. The first American station chief who was stationed there was thrown out on, caught on a sex trap, what they called a honey trap. KGB picked him right up and threw him out. We didn't know what the heck was going on in the Soviet Union. So we are guessing until we had spy satellites in the late 1950s. World War II ends in 1945. Until the late 1950s, when we had spy satellites, so we at least could look down and see if they were building missiles to kill us. We really didn't know what the heck was going on in the Soviet Union. So did we have bad information? We had no information on our chief adversary. And of course, you add to that human fear, human blunder. We made mistakes, but here we are. We didn't all get killed, and we might have, had it not been for the good judgment of Dwight Eisenhower, who I wrote about, who was our first really, truly nuclear president, and was because he had been a smart soldier, understood war, was determined to keep us out of war. We are not now radioactive dust, which we could have been if he'd made the wrong move. So, you know, we survived this dangerous period, but we were in ignorance through much of it.
Well, before we get too far from an aside that you made, I want to ask you about it. You mentioned that democracy is receding today.
Yeah. Well, what I'm thinking of, I was out at Stanford a year or two ago, and they have a professor out there named McFall, I think his name was.
Michael McFall,
yeah.
the former ambassador.
And I went to
I
was at my wife's reunion, but I went to discuss it. And they tracked democracy, and it was disturbing. It's in Eastern Europe. It's the rise of the strongman, and places like Poland and Hungary have seen their democratic norms erode. A lot of this has to do with the rule of law, whether the judiciary is truly independent and can enforce the rule of law, or is the judiciary taking orders, what my hero, Justice O'Connor, called telephone justice. Are they taking orders from the party, or are they trying to do the rule of law? And measured that way, I'm very, very, very sorry to say, I think democracy is eroding somewhat. I don't think it's necessarily cataclysmic or the end of the world or can't in turn be reversed. I'm not an expert on this. But there are signs of, after this great spread of democracy, it's sliding back.
Well, before we get into Ike's Bluff, which is another one of your books, how would you describe the 50s?
Well, confusing.
Still momentous today?
Confusing because my generation, I grew up in the 1950s, the early stereotype of the 50s was kind of boring. Kind of nice time, American prosperity is amazing. I think American incomes roughly doubled in the 1950s. It was a growth of a middle class. America did a spectacular job in the 1950s of creating and growing a middle class. Washing machines and cars and houses, and people just did great. So that's the sort of positive view of it. But of course it was also a scary time because the Soviet Union was building nuclear weapons to kill us, maybe. And we didn't really know how many or what their strength was, and we were building our own weapons, and that was scary stuff. And at the same time, in much of the world, colonialism is collapsing. We have the aftermath of colonialism in Africa and Asia. What had been British mostly, or German or French or even American, is now something else. Are there growing pains? Of course. How can you shift from a system of colonial rule to a system of self-rule without agonizing growing pains? Also being exploited and manipulated by the communists in Moscow and in Beijing and the democratic capitalists in Washington, all playing off these countries against each other. Pretty messy.
Does that world still exist today? Are we still feeling the effects of that generation?
Yes, I mean the world is still essentially a peaceful place with an open trade order. Now, I know the news is full of tariffs and Trump and all that, and it's all kind of, to an older person like me, alarming, having grown up under an earlier order. But you can get overwrought about these things. We still have an international trade order. We have some tariffs going up, but we still have an international trade. We still have conventions that bind us. These things may be dated, they may be under threat, but they still exist. And before we get too upset about this, we need to try to step back and see the broader picture, which is that world order created after 1945 still exists. It's in a perilous process of evolution. Bad things may happen. My crystal ball is terrible, but the basic sinews of it still exist.
Evan Thomas, November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Did we enter a new chapter in world history?
Well, we thought we were at the end of history. I mean, I bought into that. I thought, wow, we won, you know. Democracy won, freedom won, the rule of law won. This is great. But as some people warned, other forces were afoot. Nativism, the darker side of human nature, tribalism, fearfulness about the other. These things, I'm sorry to say, never go away because they're in our natures. Whatever political systems we try to confect, and many of the political systems do a good job of trying to help us through these terrible human urges, but the human urges are there. People are tribal. They're suspicious. They don't like the other. They want to stick to their own kind. They're easily fearful and threatened. I'm describing myself. I'm describing every human being. That's just the way we are. And so we were hoping that we were past all that with the end of the Cold War. Of course, we weren't. Some smart scholars, Samuel Huntington, I think, saw this. Remember, he wrote about the clash of civilizations, and he, in his own way, foresaw it. And I'm sure scholars going to attack him because he didn't see it exactly right. But my point is, there were some smart people who said, "Hey, don't declare victory too soon. We have some rough stuff," and I mean human stuff ahead. I just think it's always with us. It's a twilight struggle. We are always going to be struggling with ourselves to be better.
What was Ike's bluff?
Ike's bluff, which only Ike could have pulled off, was basically to threaten the Soviet Union with nuclear annihilation to keep them from either attacking us or being too aggressive in their own expansion.
How did he pull it off?
Well, pretty cagily. He let it be known that we had a lot of nuclear weapons and we were willing to use them. Now, this is not a bluff that anybody can make. It happened in our case. It was made by the supreme Allied commander in World War II, the 5-star general who had conquered Europe. If you're that man, your bluffs have credibility. Not every leader, not even the guy who followed him, Jack Kennedy, had that kind of credibility. This is a very Eisenhower thing to do. So I say all this because his foreign policy is kind of it's not really applicable to others. It worked for him. I'm not sure how well it would have worked for others. He had a particular credibility and a kind of coolness about this. He didn't allow himself to get flapped up because, I think, he had some great Kansas virtues growing up in the Midwest, a poor kid, but with wonderful values. So he had that, but he was a soldier, and he was a soldier who had seen a lot of war. Actually, not ever in combat himself. Never in combat himself. But he had sent thousands of young men off to die. So he had to live with this. He's lying in his bunk on the eve of D-Day. One man decides. One man. I think his order was something like, okay. It wasn't that grand. But he has to live with sending not just a few fellas, but whole armies off to die and hopefully to win. But that burden had strengthened him. If it doesn't, things that don't break you will make you. Look, I mean, it gave him a heart. He had a weak heart and his stomach was shot, and he was taking sleeping pills and all that when he was a president. So he paid a high physical cost for the tremendous pressure he was under. But he handled that pressure, I think, brilliantly.
And you write in Ike's Bluff that like you said, Kennedy or Johnson could not have done what he did?
I don't think so. I mean, this is now I'm in the realm of speculation and what do they call counterfactuals? You know, historians love doing counterfactuals. So what would Eisenhower or excuse me, what would Johnson or Kennedy have been like in his shoes? I don't really know. But they certainly hadn't conquered Europe. You know, they hadn't had Ike's experience. They don't seem to me to have quite the sang-froid. Did Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam have Ike's sang-froid, his coolness? I don't think so.
Evan Thomas, you spent 45 years as a contemporaneous journalist. How do you make the segue into being a historian as well? Was that at one time, was that kind of a sideline?
Yeah, they're not so easily divided. I worked for the Washington Post Company, and the owner was Katharine Graham. Her husband Phil Graham said that journalism is the rough first draft of history. I was already in the history business, somewhat in journalism, and in history, I'm in the journalism business. I'm a journalistic historian. I'm not a great archivist. I mean, I certainly use archives, but I depend on scholars. When I get into a subject, I go try to find out who are the great scholars here who've devoted their lives to this, who are going to know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm an historian who goes and finds the deep dive scholars, and I use their work, and I find them, I talk to them, help me. I'm doing it right now, actually. And so I'm a journalistic historian. As a journalist, I was a journalist who tried in the pages of Time and Newsweek to bring an historical sensibility. I mean, that sounds kind of pompous. But at least some sense of detachment. You know, news magazines, which barely exist today, would come in after the week's news. You know, we're not on. We made news occasionally, we did, but our more familiar position was to come in right after and try to give perspective and say, okay, what do we think is going on here? And sometimes we were right about that, and sometimes we were wrong or half wrong, you know, because we were pretty close. So I was already doing, you could call it an historian's work as a journalist. I'm oversimplifying this, but there is a linkage.
Before we leave President Eisenhower, one of the things I learned, I don't remember ever knowing this, you report that in his memoir, he was opposed to Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yeah, he said so. You know, there's some actually scholarly debate about this. His son, John, who I got to know, remembers a conversation where Ike in Potsdam in Germany, where Ike said, we've got this bomb and we shouldn't use it. But I think the scholars are skeptical of this because Ike didn't record it elsewhere. And it seemed to me he had, I'm trying to remember here what the scholarly debate is, but I remember reading a scholarly journal article that cast doubt on this. It made me go, huh, you know, did he really? So I actually don't know.
Well, he is not the only president you've written about, Mr. Thomas. And I don't know if you knew this, but in C-SPAN's newest book, The Presidents,
I've seen
your chapter on Richard Nixon is our featured chapter. And he is ranked in this surveys of historians that we do every couple of years as number 28, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And would you put him at 28?
I guess so. It's a hard one because President Nixon did some amazingly big stuff and good stuff in the foreign realm. I think opening up China was an amazing act of statesmanship. And also, the President of the United States goes to Moscow and negotiates the first ever nuclear arms treaty. You know, how many presidents have done that? And Nixon had a worldview that was, you can pick at it, but it was amazingly robust, and working with Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, very ambitious. He was also a very successful domestic politician. I mean, just as a politician, he got elected ran 5 national tickets, elected 4 times. Only Franklin Roosevelt has done that. He won by, I think, the second largest landslide in history, 1972. Very successful politician. They passed a lot of domestic legislation, especially in the environment. He created the EPA. He was much more effective on civil rights than people realize. I say all that because he also doomed his own presidency by his unruly emotions. he made foolish decisions because he let his emotions carry away with him, and he wrecked his legacy. He's number 28 from a self-inflicted wound there of not dealing with Watergate when he could have.
You also have a personal connection to people who run for president.
Yeah, I do.
What is that?
It's pretty tenuous. My grandfather ran a lot. My grandfather's Norman Thomas. He was the socialist candidate for president 6 times, 1928 to 1948. Now that all sounds kind of impressive. He never got more than 1 million votes. He lost, the closest he ever came, I'm not even sure it was 1 million. I think Roosevelt beat him something like 22 million to 800,000, something like that. So he was not a very extremely unsuccessful politician. But he did stand for something. It's not something I personally agree with. I'm not a socialist. But I loved him and I admired him.
Well, do you remember your father's reaction to his running for
Yeah,
president? Your father was a publishing
book editor.
executive.
My dad loved just my reaction. I got my reaction from my father. He loved his father. He didn't agree with him, but he admired him.
Was your grandfather's socialism similar to today's socialistic movements?
Oh, how am I going to give a good answer to that? I mean, it certainly involved more government in your social welfare, that for sure. More medical care, more. My grandfather's platform in 1932 looks like a sort of standard Democratic platform now. I mean, it was just any social welfare in 1932 was new. So if you actually looked at the socialist platform of 1932, it would look a lot like not just the far left of the party, but sort of the middle left of the party. So the general notion of get the government involved in helping people, yes. But, you know, this is a different age, different political situation, different.
Evan Thomas, your book, Being Nixon, came out in 2015. I think it's fair to say that it's sympathetic.
Yeah.
And not in a big
It
way. But
it wishes to be. My aim was to be. I mean, why did I write it? I think it's the 13th Nixon biography. There are a lot of Nixon biographies. So what was I going to say that was new? This is going to sound kind of conceited, but I represent the East Coast, establishment press. I'm not. My own politics actually moderate or nothing. I'm not sure I have any politics, but I'm a type. I went to Harvard. I'm a type, and the type that Nixon hated. Nixon hated people like me, not me personally, but he hated people like me. And so I thought that it'd be interesting to try to reverse engineer this. In a sympathetic way, how did he see me? Or how did he see us? How did he see the establishment? How did he see the Washington Post company for which I worked? Well, how did that world look to him? And what was it like being him? That's why the book is called Being Nixon. So I made the best effort I could to switch the lens. So instead of me looking at him, in a way, it's him looking at me. It's much more than that. But that was the impetus of the book. And the best parts of the book, really, are sympathetic about just moments he had with the East Coast establishment where they treated him terribly. And you begin to understand why he was resentful. Now, he let this stuff get out of control. He really did. And he ended up getting brought down by the Washington Post, ironically, or maybe suitably. I'm not sure what the right word here is. But I am sympathetic about that because he was treated badly by my kind. He really was.
Why?
Stupidity, snobbery, tribalism, that we were talking about earlier. I mean, there's a scene in the '60 election, and they're all in some garden party in Georgetown, and it's Arthur Schlesinger and Jack Kennedy. They're all sucking up to Jack Kennedy, and there's something vaguely offensive about it. There's the smugness and a primness and a kind of aren't we better looking, aren't we better dressed, aren't we just better than Nixon? And of course Nixon would know about all that and feel put down, and there was an arrogance to it that Nixon was right to be aggrieved by, but also cleverly played off of. Some of our politics today is the descendant of Richard Nixon figuring out, hey, you can get votes by running against these people, this establishment, the lamestream presses. They didn't have that word then, but you can, this can work for you. Populism, not all the way out there, and he discovered this at Whittier College. I'm just going to tell you one story about this because it's so revealing to me. Nixon is a student politician. He's not very popular. He's not that likable. He's not an easy guy. But at Whittier College, the issue was dancing. It was a Quaker school, conservative, no dancing. Nixon runs on the pro-dancing ticket. Nixon himself couldn't dance at all. He runs on it because he realizes that the rich kids can go dancing. They can go into clubs in LA and country clubs and all that. It's the poor kids who can't. There are a lot more poor kids than rich kids at Whittier College in 1932. Nixon wins in a landslide. It's a rich against poor thing, but it's being sensitive to the needs of the needier kids and running against the rich kids. So there was a snooty fraternity called the Franklins, and Nixon's founded as an opposing fraternity called the Orthogonians, kind of the little man's party. It was, the football halfback might be in the Franklins, and the linemen were in the Oregonians, but there were more of them. There were more linemen than halfbacks. Just do the math. Smart politics.
The silent majority.
The word that he coined. Richard Nixon coined the word, not a speechwriter. Richard Nixon coined the word, the silent majority, and he happened to win after that. The next election he ran, and he won with more votes than any president in history, and a greater percentage of votes than anybody. But I think LBJ in '64 was like a hair better. So it worked.
From your book, Being Nixon, Nixon refused to cash in as an ex-president by sitting on corporate boards and taking directors or speaking fees.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been disputed a little bit. Somebody was telling me that, like a lot of Nixon statements, that one's not 100% true. But I think it's generally true. Nixon, in his own way, had principles. Nixon hated, that thing, I'm a crook, I am a crook. He hated that because he didn't see himself that way at all. He saw himself as somebody who didn't steal and didn't graft and do all that stuff. Now there are endless debates about this because Nixon had some sweet deals from friends. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds on whether Nixon was or was not a crook. But I know Nixon was really offended by this picture of him being. And when to your point, when he retired, he wanted to make his money honestly by writing books about great subjects.
A little bit more from Being Nixon before we break from this topic. Nixon's relationship to Reagan's successor was problematic. Nixon told his family that he thought Bush was, quote, the perfect vice president. Bush had his own doubts about Nixon, which he expressed in a perceptive letter in July 1974. Quote, this is George H.W. Bush writing to his sons about Nixon. He is enormously complicated. He is capable of great kindness. I am not that close to him as a warm personal friend, for he holds people off some. But I've been around him enough to see some humor and to feel some kindness. And it goes on to say that deep in his heart, Richard Nixon knew that George H.W. Bush feels he's soft, not tough enough, not willing to do the gut job that his political instincts have taught him.
A very astute letter by George H.W. Bush was a very astute judge of character and not an unsympathetic one. That thing you read is quite sympathetic to Nixon. But that's a pretty accurate portrayal, I would say.
The hardball Nixon never quite went away. He threatened both Bush and Clinton with going public against them if they did not follow his advice on Russia.
Oh, man, Nixon was Nixon.
But you go on to say that Bill Clinton left him on hold for an hour or wouldn't take his calls when he first came into office, did not attend Pat Nixon's funeral.
Yeah.
Was there ever a resolve to that relationship? As
Clinton ended up liking Nixon. This is actually very apropos. Initially, Clinton was kind of a snob to Nixon, actually, dismissive of him, that awful Richard Nixon. By the end of his presidency, Clinton was praising Nixon's advice on the former Soviet Union. President Clinton trusted Nixon's advice. Nixon was smart about the populist forces going on in the Soviet Union and read it pretty well, was pro-Yeltsin, and Clinton listened. And they, I don't know if they bonded. Clinton has an amazing ability to bond with almost anybody. So I'm not sure bond is the right word, but there was some warmth there.
Evan Thomas, how many U.S. presidents have you met and interviewed?
Well, let's see, I got to count them. I met Nixon, of course, although I didn't interview him. I met him and had a brief conversation with him. I met Clinton. I met Reagan and interviewed him. George H.W. Bush. Pretty much all of them through Obama. I've never met Donald Trump, but the rest I have.
Evan Thomas is our guest here on Book TV. He is the author of several books. We're going to show those to you right now so you can get a sense of what we've been talking about. The Wise Men with Walter Isaacson was his first. That came out in 1986. The Man to See, The Life of Edward Bennett Williams, 1992. The Very Best Men, The Early Years of the CIA, came out in 96. Robert Kennedy, His Life, came out in 2000. John Paul Jones, 2004. Sea of Thunder, Four Naval Commanders and the Last Sea War, was out in 2007. The War Lovers, Roosevelt, Lodge, Hearst, and the Rush to Empire in 1898, came out about 9 years ago. Ike's Bluff came out in 2012. Being Nixon in 2015. His most recent, which we haven't really touched on yet, just came out this year. First, it's about Sandra Day O'Connor, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Plus, I do want to mention that Evan Thomas is the historian that C-SPAN has chosen for its chapter on Richard Nixon. The new book is called The Presidents, Rating, or How Noted Historians Rank America's Best and Worst Chief Executives. We have a different historian for every president. Evan Thomas's information about Richard Nixon is our chapter in that book. 202 is the area code if you'd like to participate in our conversation this afternoon, 748-8200. If you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201. For those of you out in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, we'll begin taking those calls in just a few minutes. Also want to mention that you can contact us via social media. We'll scroll through those addresses on the screen, but the only thing you have to really remember for Twitter and Facebook and Instagram is @BookTV. Email is booktv@cspan.org. Who was Edward Bennett Williams, and shouldn't we know, was he consequential in the long run?
Well, certainly consequential among lawyers. He was a unique Washington figure. He was the name of the book was The Man to See, because in Washington, if you were in trouble, you went to Edward Bennett Williams, because he could get you off. I mean, he did. He got off all sorts of people. Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamster leader, Adam Clayton Powell, a black congressman who got himself into trouble, John Connolly, the governor of Texas. I mean, a lot of people. He was a unique figure because he was a unique figure because he represented both mafia figures, real lowlifes, and advised presidents of the United States. An unusual combination that doesn't really exist today. He's not well known today, but maybe he should be, because he was such an incredibly good lawyer. He used to say, it's funny, he would take his young lawyers out for dinner, and they'd say, "Oh, gee, Mr. Williams, we want to be like you." And he would say, "You can't." And it was this kind of arrogant, but really what he was saying is they don't have lawyers like that anymore in Washington. It's now specialized. You know, you can't be the kind of lawyer who could represent a mafia don and the President of the United States and and everybody in between. That general practice of law, that's all gone.
Would Robert Kennedy have been elected in 1968?
I would like to say yes, because it's kind of romantic to think so, but I'm influenced by his chief advisor, Fred Dutton. Fred Dutton told me no, because we forget that the Democratic Party in 1968 was still the party of bosses. Union bosses and city machine bosses, and those people were pretty pledged to Hubert Humphrey. So it was going to take quite an earthquake to dislodge Hubert Humphrey. Now, maybe Kennedy would have done it. He won California right before he was shot at night. Maybe there would have been a head of steam building up that summer, and he would have won in New York and all that. And he would have. The mythology has always been that Mayor Daley of Chicago had pledged to him his support, and that was going to be the machine boss who saved him. I think that's actually true. Like a lot of myths in history, I don't think that. I don't really believe that one. So, my realistic political hat says no. He would not have even won the nomination. If he had won the nomination, Nixon might have beaten him because, and this is a little counterintuitive, Bobby Kennedy was hot, and TV is a cool medium, and it punishes hotness. And Nixon might have been cooler. You think of Nixon as being terrible on TV, but I'm not so sure on this case. You watch old clips of Bobby Kennedy, and he got a little kind of out there, and he would either overheat, or he would stutter, or he would kind of go off in this surreal thing. He wasn't that good. He wasn't that good on TV. We think of the Kennedys as loving TV and being great at TV. Jack Kennedy was unbelievably good at TV. The TV made love to him, but Bobby Kennedy less so.
Bobby Kennedy was the godfather to one of Joe McCarthy's children.
Yeah. Well, Bobby was a young Senate staffer on that committee, what it was called, the Internal Investigations Committee or whatever it was. So they actually had a working relationship. But more than that, Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe, went out with one of Bobby's sisters. I can't remember which one. I remember her, maybe it was Eunice, saying that she remembered that McCarthy kissed really hard. I remember that weird detail. I think it was Eunice, but maybe it was Jean. I can't remember which one it was. But anyways, Joe McCarthy would show up at the Kennedy family place up in Hyannisport on the weekend. He didn't like to swim. He didn't sort of fit in, but there he was. And so, and there was a kind of loyalty, Irish Catholic bond there. Old Joe Kennedy, kind of like Joe McCarthy's anti-communism, was familiar, and the Kennedy family supported. So there was some linkage there.
Well, Evan Thomas, let's take some calls, hear what our viewers have on their mind. This is Jim in Caliente, California. Good afternoon or good morning, Jim.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my call. It's really been fascinating listening to Mr. Thomas. My common question, you talk about Eisenhower's Ike's Bluff, and I'm thinking that the person that would have been president if it hadn't been Eisenhower would have been Stevenson, who I think would have, I totally agree, would not have been able to pull off Ike's Bluff at all. The thought of Stevenson as president, and he was a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant and capable, but looking back at it, I just don't think and I grew up during that period. I was 7 when Eisenhower was elected president, so I kind of was following it very carefully even then. And also, you also talk about, and in the thing about Ike's Bluff, what about Reagan? Didn't Reagan do something similar to that with Gorbachev during the end of the Cold War period, right before
Yes.
Jim, thank you for that call. Let's hear from Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I share most of what the viewer said. I agree with. I don't think that Stevenson was as well suited for the era as Ike was. Stevenson had many qualities. He was a truly intelligent person, and he had strong followers, and he may have done good things in other realms. He may have been, a little quicker on civil rights and, just other things. And to be fair, these counterfactuals are hard. It's hard to imagine what might have happened. Maybe Stevenson would have been better about using the United Nations and diplomacy to bring the world to a safer place. So maybe, maybe he would have been. I doubt it, but maybe. And what was his other point?
Reagan and
Reagan,
Gorbachev.
Yeah. I mean, Reagan. You can overstate this. Reagan won the Cold War. I think a lot of things happened. Reagan had more to do with the Soviet Union collapsing from within. But it's definitely true that Reagan, by standing tall and building up our military, and that was intimidating to the Soviets. They realized they didn't really have the technology that we did. You know, there's that image of the desk in the Kremlin with all the telephones because they couldn't even have one telephone. And they were spending themselves on military spending into kind of ruin, and they couldn't keep up. And so you could make an argument, I've read an argument, that Reagan kind of did outbluff the Soviet Union. I've also heard that argument criticized by people who say there are many other factors. This is not a period that I'm really well versed in, and I could quickly outrun my supply lines here.
Well, Evan Thomas, given your 40, 50 years of being a Washingtonian and insider in a sense, what's that one quality that every U.S. president seems to have?
Well, the one quality they need is judgment. Judgment. I mean, it's everything, but judgment is a broad spectrum of things. They all have ambition, and they all have a lust for power because they must. They couldn't get there without that. So it's a necessary thing. I'm not critical of that lust for power. It is a crucial ingredient of becoming president, but it's not enough. Once you get there, you have to govern, and a power urge can help you govern. It can. And a sense of power can help you. It helped Richard Nixon and others helped. I help everybody I've written about. But if your judgment is poor, and if your emotional judgment is poor, you're going to get yourself into trouble, and not just you, but the whole country into trouble with you. Richard Nixon being the extreme example, but Lyndon Johnson, a great president in so many ways, was emotionally not suited for it in a way, and he just kind of melted down over Vietnam.
Next call for Evan Thomas comes from Jonathan in Milwaukee. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I've seen Evan Thomas on shows like Inside Washington with Gordon Peterson and other shows. It's an honor to speak with you, sir. And I want to ask about Justice O'Connor.
Please.
In Jan Crawford's book about the Supreme Court from about a dozen years ago, she reported that Justice Brennan tended to rub Justice O'Connor the wrong way, and that influenced her to vote more conservative during the 80s. But in the 90s, Justice Thomas did not get along very well with Justice O'Connor. And Justice O'Connor had issues with him, and that helped influence her to vote more towards the quote-unquote liberal side in the 90s and in the early 2000s. I wondered if in your research you found any evidence to corroborate that claim.
Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah. There's some truth to both those things, but there are important qualifications. In Brennan's case, it's true that Justice O'Connor didn't totally trust Brennan, who she thought she thought that Justice Brennan had a liberal agenda and that he would salt things into opinions to further his agenda, and Justice O'Connor instructed her clerks to look for the footnotes and for the little things that Brennan was up to. So she had a somewhat adversarial relationship with Brennan. At the same time, she liked Brennan. She liked him. He was a warm guy, and she liked him. So you can overstate that gap. Same thing on the Thomas side. Yes, Justice Thomas was, like Justice Scalia, a pretty doctrinaire conservative, an originalist, all that. And Justice O'Connor was pragmatic, middle of the road, different kind of jurisprudence. On the other hand, Justice Thomas told me a story about how it was Justice O'Connor who got Justice Thomas to come to lunch after his confirmation hearings, which have been really tough. Remember, the Anita Hill hearings were really tough, and tough on Justice Thomas, of course. And Justice Thomas told me, he said, I was feeling hammered, and she was the one who made me come to lunch. And he said that changed everything, that my life on the court got much better. And so there was some closeness there. When Justice Thomas bought his famous RV, he travels around the country in the summer in his RV, he went to Phoenix to buy that, and the O'Connor family went out and bought it with him. So they were personally close. And Justice, lastly, I just won't go on and on here, Justice Thomas told me that Sandra Day O'Connor was the glue, the one who made this place civil, who made the court civil. And the Supreme Court wasn't so civil before she got there. I gather it's not so civil right now, but certainly in the 1990s, she made it a more civil place.
I get from your book first that she was not a terribly, and she's still alive at this point,
Yes,
correct?
she is. She has Alzheimer's. Well, she has dementia, probably Alzheimer's.
Well, I get the idea from your book that she has not been a warm and fuzzy person necessarily, a huggy, touchy type person.
That's a complicated question. Yeah, she can be very intimidating. She can be scary. When I met her as a journalist, she was pretty scary. She has these flashing eyes, and she can be a little severe. But, and this is a very important but, there is a loving side to her that those who get to know her really feel. Her law clerks, my wife and I, Osi and I, interviewed 94 of her 100-odd law clerks. So we got to know her world. And those law clerks loved her. They found her austere and a little scary, especially when they first started. But over time, they realized how much she cared about them. Not every justice cares about his clerks. In fact, most of them don't, or not that much. She did. And that meant the world to them. She also could be very political and skillful. I've watched her work a room. In fact, I saw her when she had Alzheimer's work a room. You'd never know she had Alzheimer's. And she had a warmth, and she could look you in the eye and all that. So this idea of her severity, you can overstate it. Like most people, she's complicated. She has different sides. The different sides show at different times and in different ways.
You tell a couple of stories. Number one, her time in the Arizona legislature was a good path to the Supreme Court in a sense.
Well, it was, in two senses. One, it raised her profile. She was the first ever majority leader of a state, first ever female majority leader of a state senate in history. And at a time when there just weren't women, generally in the law. And so when her number came up, when President Reagan was looking for a woman Supreme Court justice, and he let it be known that he was serious, he really did want a woman, there weren't that many. There, out of the 600 federal judges, I think there were only 8 women judges. They were almost all liberal Democrats, right? She was pretty much it. She wasn't even a federal judge. She was a state court of appeals judge at that time. So, her profile helped her get on the radar screen. But more than that, more importantly than that, being in the legislature helped her learn how to deal with obnoxious men.
She was not intimidated.
She was not intimidated. You can imagine Arizona state legislature or any state legislature
and all
in
those
1970.
sons.
And, there are a lot of obnoxious men who are hard to deal with. And she learned how to deal with them, usually sometimes by humoring them, sometimes by just walking away. She was very good about not getting into stupid fights, ego fights. She just avoided that stuff. And every once in a while, standing up to them. There's one story I have to tell, which is my favorite on this. There was a House Appropriations Committee chairman, was a guy named Tom Goodwin, and he was a drunk, a real drunk, a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And she called him on his drinking. And he looked at her and said, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she looked him back and said, "If you were a man, you could." Ouch. Now, that's a fun story, but it's kind of a one-off. She didn't do that. She picked her shots. She didn't go around getting into fights. Mostly, she would disarm the adversary without ceding any dignity. She could retreat without losing any dignity. Or not so much retreat, but just avoid.
Get her to the court. You talk about her coming down the hall and one of her clerks hiding something in the drawer very quickly.
She
out of fear.
Yeah, well, she believed, she was a very athletic woman herself, not a scratch golfer, but 14 handicap golfer, horsewoman, fly fisherman, all that. She wanted her clerks to be in good shape, physical good shape. So the women had to take an aerobics class with her up on the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court basketball court, every 8 a.m. every day, those poor women are out there doing aerobics with the justice. The men were not required to do that. However, one of the clerks, male clerks, is eating an ice cream cone. She comes around the corner. He puts it in a drawer so that she won't see him.
How did you get access to her husband's diaries?
They were in her diaries were in her papers. We got access to her papers because this is a book that was written with the family's cooperation. so we had her papers are in the Library of Congress. They are closed, and they opened the papers for us, and there were the diaries.
And you say we.
When I say we, my wife and I was deeply involved in this. My wife, Osi, who's a lawyer, I met Osi in civil procedure class at the University of Virginia Law School, and she went on to have a long career in the law. I didn't. I never practiced law. So she's a real lawyer, I'm not. And she carefully read the cases. But more than that, she went on my interviews with me, almost all of them, and she's edited all my books for years. But this one was different because she was really deeply involved. I've never written about a woman before. And you know, and also Osi's from the West, grew up in California, went to Stanford, like Justice O'Connor, and just helped me understand her, helped me understand Justice O'Connor better.
Next call for Evan Thomas comes from Karen in Detroit. Karen, thanks for holding. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. I've been really enjoying the conversation about Sandra Day O'Connor, but I wanted to go back for a moment to Richard Nixon, and I wonder if Evan Thomas, in his research of Nixon and being a journalist, was aware that Nixon paved the path for the first black-owned and operated TV station in the United States when he granted a broadcast license to William V. Banks that opened the path for Dr. Banks to start, and he was here in Detroit, the first black-owned and operated independent TV station in the United States.
Now, Karen,
And,
what station was that, or is that?
Well, the station went on the air in 1975, was WGPR TV 62. The station, when it went on the air, made national headlines because it was a pioneer in broadcasting. Today, there is a museum in the original studios of the station devoted to that history. And William Banks was invited to the White House at the time, and Nixon told him that he would work to help establish and get him a broadcast license, which ultimately did happen. And so Mr. Thomas, as a journalist, I thought might have been interested.
Yeah, really
It's
interested.
a footnote in Detroit history because the city is, you know, widely known as the auto capital, Motown, but this is an important piece of history. And I was just curious if Mr. Thomas was aware of it.
Karen, pardon me,
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Thomas. Karen, you seem to have a pretty intimate knowledge. Are you part of the Banks family? Did you work there?
Well, it was my first job out of college. I did work at the station as an intern, left as news director. I knew William Banks at the time. His granddaughter, who has written a book about him, and I'm executive director of the William V. Banks Broadcast Museum, which, as I said, is in Detroit and tells the story of Nixon, really of the station's history. And there's another Republican president has a footprint at the museum. Gerald Ford sent a broadcast message that was aired on the station. It's a video that people can see at the museum congratulating the station on being the first black-owned and operated television station in the United States.
All right. Karen, thanks for that. Evan Thomas.
I'm fascinated to hear that. I knew that Nixon had, I didn't know about that, but I knew that Nixon had a much better civil rights record than people think of. Politically, Nixon is known for the Southern strategy and for trying to stir up white votes in the South in unattractive ways. And that's true. But at the same time, and Nixon's such a contradictory figure that you always have to look at the but in his case, Nixon was the guy who actually made integration happen in the South in his time. I mean, that even though the Supreme Court had ordered it in 1954, it still hadn't happened by 1968. Nixon made it happen. And you could say, well, he did that because the courts ordered it. Well, other presidents hadn't done it. Nixon did. And interestingly, and to the point of our viewer here, in the 50s, Nixon really reached out to the black community. Republicans in the 1950s, the party of Lincoln, had some ties to the black community that the Democrats didn't have. We forget all this. The Democratic Party's base was Southern whites. The South was the base of the Democratic Party, the white South. And Nixon, partly for political reasons, made a play for African-American vote, but not just for political reasons. There, for instance, when Nixon was in college, Nixon made sure that his fraternity took in a black athlete, as it happened. I think maybe two. There's a record of Nixon being pretty progressive on race as a young person, all forgotten, all overlooked, because Nixon's later politics made people, and rightly made people uncomfortable. But Nixon, I can't say enough what a complicated guy he was. And I know, just the last point, Nixon understood that it was really important for African Americans in this country to have some economic benefit. That they had, not to put too fine a point about it, just been cut out. They couldn't get mortgages, and they just didn't have the chance to accumulate wealth. And Nixon understood this and cared about. He was an early affirmative action guy. He cared about making sure that the wealth was spread around a little bit, so it wasn't just something that whites had and blacks did not. This has all been sort of lost in the dust of history, but Nixon's record on this was actually pretty good.
And Evan Thomas, that goes to your point about the election at Whittier, the Oregonians versus the majority, the silent majority.
Right.
Gerald Ford also had that early connection with equal rights, didn't he?
Yeah, I know less about Ford than I do about Nixon, but there was a strand. The Republican Party got branded as being, the Democrats became the party of African Americans, the Republicans not. That's not the way it was in the 1950s. If anything, it was the reverse. The 1960 election flipped that somewhat for a lot of complicated reasons. The Kennedys were much better about openly playing to Martin Luther King. Nixon sort of blew it in that campaign. But as usual, history is murkier and more complicated than we think it is, or at least, it's sort of a cliche, but that's true, and that's true in Nixon and race.
Well, speaking of murky, you've written both about Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. What was their relationship in your view? What's your take on that?
Murky, because, look, Nixon ended up marrying Eisenhower. Nixon's daughter married Eisenhower's grandson.
Still married.
And they're still married, very happily married. So there's a real bond there. Eisenhower endorsed Nixon in '68, but when Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president, talk about cold people. Ike could be cold. And he was pretty cold with Nixon. He didn't know Nixon. Nixon really was put on the ticket for political reasons to younger voters, Western voters. And Eisenhower tried to dump Nixon a couple of times from the ticket. And Eisenhower's idea was for Nixon's own good, so he could be Secretary of Defense in the second term. It sort of made sense to Eisenhower, seasoning for, but to Nixon, it just looked like he was getting dumped. And it was very hurtful to him. And I'm not sure Eisenhower really liked Nixon. What I'm thinking of, John Eisenhower, Eisenhower's son, President Eisenhower's son, told me this. He said that my father told me that that he said he gave himself an order to like Dick Nixon. He may have been making an exaggerating here, but Nixon was not always the most likable guy. So there was some coolness there. Yes, there was. But at the end of Eisenhower's life, I think they got along fine.
Next call for Evan Thomas is Paul in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Paul, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Paul Ricci. My question is, let me turn you off speaker. Hello, my question is, it's been written about ad nauseum about Nixon and the Kennedys and Johnson and the Kennedys. My question is, what was the relationship between Nixon and Johnson? I mean, they had similar backgrounds and they weren't that different as to how they governed.
Thank you, Paul.
The relationship was surprisingly good. They were both tough politicians, and I think in 1968, you could say that LBJ was in a way more for Nixon than he was for Humphrey, for his own vice president, because Humphrey was being seduced by the Peace Party, the peace wing in the Democratic Party, to try to end the Vietnam War by retreating. And Johnson wanted to stay the course a little bit more, and he thought that Nixon would be a smarter, tougher prosecutor of his policies in Vietnam than Humphrey. So right there, the Democratic president is in some ways more sympathetic to the Republican challenger to his own vice president. I mean, you have to stop and sort of think how these pieces fit together, but I think that's true, or there's historical evidence. I know my friend Luke Nichter at Texas A&M believes that and is working on something that's going to show that. So there's that. But there was an affinity of being tough, smart politicians. It's kind of the club of very practical, very hardball politicians. And I think LBJ and Nixon had a bond of, let's do the hard thing in politics. Let's be tough. Let's not be soft. They overdid that at times, but I think there was some mutual respect there.
Evan Thomas, could you have written Being Nixon and called it Being Johnson, about the same type of approach to the book, establishment?
Yeah, there's some of that, because I mean, certainly Johnson's resentments against the Harvards, as he called them, this is kind of love-hate relationship. He liked being surrounded by them, but he wanted to own them. The crudest example, the famous example, is where he summons McGeorge Bundy, the former dean at Harvard, into his bathroom while he's going to the bathroom, in a way to kind of control him, shame him, gross him out. It's a very crude image. It's a very crude image, so I apologize for even mentioning it, but it's a stark one that shows Johnson's almost weird relationship to the East Coast establishment, resenting them, fearing them, but also wanting to control them and use them at the same time. Complicated. People are complicated.
Mike, San Diego, please go ahead with your question or comment for Evan Thomas.
Hi. You mentioned a minute ago about TV being the cool medium, and I wonder if that's true anymore with the way, Trump is anything but cool on TV, or is TV just secondary for him to rallies and social media as his media strategy?
Yeah. That's Thanks. A pretty good point. Yeah. Pretty good point. Got me.
What's your take? What's your take on
Trump's
the current
pretty
president?
Effective.
Where do you put him in history? I know it's
Oh, it's way too early.
I know, but when he appears on TV, when he speaks,
he's effective.
Who do you compare him to?
He's an effective communicator. He's hard to compare him to anybody because he doesn't fit neatly into our notions of the presidency. And remember this, when I was fascinated when this all began, people kept writing, well, President Trump needs to become presidential. And when he was a candidate, he needs to become presidential.
Did you ever write those words?
No, because I didn't think that's what he was bringing to the table. I didn't write that. I might have wished it in some way, but I didn't write it because he was clearly selling something else, which wasn't presidential. It was Trumpian. You can use different adjectives, but it wasn't presidential. He's changed the game. And for that alone, he's going to be remembered. And he's an extremely effective communicator. Your viewer is right. But that's confounding because I just say, TV is a cool medium. Well, Trump is not cool, but he's a pretty effective communicator. So that's kind of the point, that he broke the norm. He has broken the norms. We can all get all hot and bothered about how he broke the norms, but the fact is he's broken the norms, and that's just an example of it.
Evan Thomas, you have two semi-contemporaneous histories of the presidency that I want to make sure that we mention, and that includes A Long Time Coming, about Barack Obama, and Back from the Dead, about Bill Clinton. What are those collections?
Every year, Newsweek, I work for Newsweek, and every election year, presidential election year, Newsweek, much to its credit, and this shows you how time has passed, would dedicate an enormous team of reporters to just doing a single article, one article, that would appear on election day, and it would be a chronicle of the campaign. And we would have maybe 4 or 5 reporters, and I was the rewrite guy. My role in that was to be the person who takes their reporting and puts it into what was a 50,000-word article. It would be the entire issue, basically. It would be about 2/3 the issue. It was a 50,000-word article. And then a couple of times we turn it into books. The reason why you have my name is on those, that was just the magazine article printed as a book. I think we added a little tiny bit, but essentially it was the magazine article printed as a book. my name's on it, but it should be, I'm the rewrite guy. I'm taking other people's reporting, and I'm very proud of those things. They were real. That was journalism. I think Newsweek spent at least $1 million on each one of those things. That's a big journalistic commitment to one story.
Tweet for you from Marshall. Mr. Thomas, please speak about your writing process, and do you have any advice for authors? And Marshall is in Houston, Texas.
My writing process.
Has it changed over the years also? And I'll add that to his question.
I'm not going to be very helpful on this because I have many. I don't suffer from writer's block. I just don't. I have many flaws, believe me, but I don't have trouble writing. So I don't really have an elaborate process. I wrote so much for news magazines. I wrote thousands of words from news magazines on deadline. So whatever writer's block I had went away because I just did it so often and so much that I just don't suffer from that thing. Now, that's not to say the first drafts are any good. My wife has to fix them. But I don't have any problem getting going. So I'm not that helpful in giving people advice because it's just something I do naturally. I mean, it's one of the few things. I have a terrible, I'm not good at golf, but I am good at writing. Or I'm quick at writing.
Do you take a notepad? Do you do it on a computer, a typewriter, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, books, I spend a lot of time putting together these chronologies on a computer but they're sort of chronological finding aids. They're in chronology year by year, but where to find stuff? Because when you're writing a book, you amass tons of books and notes and interviews. Where is all that stuff in my study? Where is it? Or if I remember something, where did I find it? So it's really to help me when I go back to write to know where did I find this, so then I can go back and look at it when I'm in that section. And I write in chronology. I write narratives that are in chronology. So that is the one device I would use, or I would recommend to writers. I think it's good to write in chronology, and if you do, it's much easier to organize material.
How do you avoid thinking with your fingers if you're typing on a computer?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, because you're typing and thinking at the same time. Does that work for you? Sometimes if I'm writing something, I have to sit and think about it.
Yeah.
At first, and before I start to type it. Otherwise.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I wish I always thought before. Sometimes I type before I think, and that's a mistake because I've written some pretty stupid things. But I try to slow down and think. That's a good idea. Think before you write. That's a good idea. One thing I do when I'm getting ready to write something difficult, an op-ed or a beginning chapter, I will walk around. I will wander around. Take a walk. I mean, I will play lonely bad golf, or I will, if it's the summer, I'm near a beach. I try to go walk on a beach, or I just walk around the neighborhood, and just sort of marinate. Just kind of walk around while because it's a confusing cloud in my head. It always is. It's just blur, or it's like white noise. But after a while, it will settle, and I'll see some order, some pattern. Now, it's not always a correct order. Because just as important as that walking around is the rewriting. I will write stuff, and it's wrong or wrong-headed. Then my wife gets involved, or other editors get involved, and then I rewrite it.
This is an email, and this is from Marcia. I'm 74 years old and thinking about what might come next. After listening to Evan Thomas, David McCullough, and many others, I've decided I want to come back as Michael Hill. Please tell us more about Mr. Hill.
Oh, I love to hear Mike Hill come up here. Michael Hill is the most wonderful human being ever. He just is. His human qualities. The reason why he's come up here is he's the researcher primarily for David McCullough, but also for many other historians, including, I am happy to say, me. He's worked on a number of books with me. And he's a genius at finding stuff, particularly in obscure libraries. Librarians like him. We sometimes joke that librarians love books so much they don't want anybody to read them. And Mike is really great because he is such a decent person, at befriending, and because he's a smart guy, he can find stuff and then get to know the archivists, and he finds these little treasures. And so popular historians, primarily David McCullough, but also Nat Philbrick has used him, and John Meacham, and Michael Beschloss,
And
Sally
Evan
Dale
Thomas.
Smith, and Evan Thomas. And I've used them a lot over the years, and I hope to use him in the future because he's just a wonderful, wonderful resource. He's a gem.
Next call for Evan Thomas comes from Carl in Highlands, New Jersey. Hi, Carl.
Good afternoon. My question is about Nixon. You mentioned that Nixon was brought down by Woodward and Bernstein. Don't we know today that it was Mark Felt in the FBI who fed them the information? There was probably a cabal in the FBI feeding that steady stream of information, and Woodward and Bernstein were simply dupes of the FBI, like what the FBI has tried to do to Trump.
All right, Carl, thank you.
It was certainly true that Mark Felt, who was dubbed Deep Throat by Bob Woodward, was an important source for Bob Woodward. He wasn't the only source. Woodward and Bernstein went around. They talked to a lot of people. Yes, they did talk to, Woodward talked to Mark Felt, yes. And Mark Felt also talked to Sandy Smith of Time magazine primarily, and maybe some others. But Woodward and Bernstein were knocking on a lot of doors. Committee to re-elect the president, prosecutors, they had multiple sources. So this was not, by any means, purely an FBI thing. The best book on this is called Leak by Max Holland. He wrote a book about Felt, basically, and about the and Max Holland really got into this question. So I would recommend, if you want to know kind of what really happened, I found that to be the most useful book on how Watergate got. Watergate's a big topic, and Woodward and Bernstein played a critical role, but there were many others involved as well.
And I know our producer Nick is checking to see if Book TV covered that book, and we'll let you know, and then you can watch Leak on our website at booktv.org. You talked about that being the best book in your view on that topic. Some of your favorite books include Herman Wouk, who just passed,
just
101 years old.
Yeah.
Robert Penn Warren, All the King's Men.
Yeah.
John Meacham.
Yeah.
Is he a friend of yours as
He's
well?
a friend of mine. He's a close friend of mine. I love that book because he inhabited George H.W. Bush. If you want, all biographers wish to do this, to get into the head of, or the soul, heart of our subjects. It's hard to do. We do our best, but we fall short. John Meacham, in the case of George H.W. Bush, actually succeeded. That's that rare book, maybe singular book, where the author inhabited the person that he was writing about, not uncritically, but the heart and soul and mind of George H.W. Bush. You want to know what it was? Read that book.
Well, just to go back to your latest book first, you write in there that George H.W. Bush's wife, Barbara Bush, and Sandra Day O'Connor were good friends.
They were. They played tennis together once a week on the vice president's tennis court. They both had a strong personality, which they would use on occasion. I think that maybe Sandra O'Connor was a little more politic than Barbara Bush was. Barbara Bush is more outspoken, although Sandra could be outspoken at times. Anyways, they were good friends. They were smart, tough, able, strong women.
Mr. Thomas, after an appointment and a confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, do they ever see their patron again? Did Sandra Day O'Connor know Ronald Reagan socially or in any way afterwards, and for all the justices?
A little bit. She danced with him on New Year's Eve at the Annenberg estate on the first year. She went to the White House a couple of times. But did she get to know him well? No. No, they would talk about ranching, and there was a natural affinity there, but no. And it's for the obvious reason, and this is something that's wonderful about our country. Let's stop and think about this for a second. Justices do not spend time hanging around with the president. Why? they have to keep their distance. They are a third branch of government. They may have to make rulings that affect the person in the White House. And so they need to keep their distance a little bit. They can be friendly enough, but I remember Abe Fortas, when he was a justice, had a telephone that connected him to LBJ in the White House. That was a mistake. That was wrong. It was unusual. It was a one-off. It got Fortas into trouble. That's the exception that proves the rule.
Peter, Richmond, Virginia. Hi, Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call. I read your book about Edward Bennett Williams, A Man to See, when it first came out. And I remember being so impressed with the wide variety of cases that he handled. And so I guess after about 25 years, I finally get to ask you, are there any publicly available transcripts of those trials if someone wanted to, read them and see how he handled them and that sort of thing?
Yes, I'm sure there are. This is a little bit of a complicated question because I had access to his papers. So I had stuff from the law firm that I could look at. So you're asking, where would you find them today? There are court transcripts for sure. And I think if you Google, actually, I'm doing this off the top of my head here. If you Google the case, I'll bet you can find transcripts just through the internet. In my case, I'm doing this pre-internet. This is 1988, 9, and so I'm working from files of Williams' own files from his papers. Those are not available to you. But I'll bet you through the internet you can find a lot of transcripts, certainly in federal courts, just by Googling.
Just to go back to leaked, Max Holland.
Yeah.
It is. If you go to cspan.org, booktv.org, you will be able to watch. Just type up in the search function Max Holland. The video will come up, and you'll be able to watch it at your leisure online for free. Next call from Mr. Thomas is Norm in Puyallup, Washington. Norm, you're on Book TV.
Yeah, that's Puyallup. It's an
Thank
Indian
you.
name.
I get it wrong every time.
As is Tacoma, as is Seattle, as is Spokane in the state of Washington. Evan, you're obviously, an expert on the legal system. I've heard two sayings, and I'd just like to get your feedback on them if you feel there's any truthfulness. The legal system is a spider web through which the big flies pass and the little flies get caught. Another one is if you can't find a lawyer who knows the law, find a lawyer who knows the judge. Do you think there's any accuracy at all to those old sayings?
I think there's accuracy because all old sayings have a kernel of truth. Stereotypes are stereotypes because they're true. But the important thing here is how they're wrong. Those statements are actually, in the large sense, the meta sense, the mega sense, wrong. More than any system in the history of mankind, our legal system is fair, and it does catch the big flies. Not all of them. Some have good lawyers. They hire Edward Bennett Williams, and they get away with stuff. That's true. And it's certainly true after the 2008 financial crisis. None of the big investment bankers were brought to heel. So I can give you a lot of examples of people escaping justice. But if you step way back and you look at our legal system, it's remarkably effective, and it has worked in ways that no other system has. I mean, the history of mankind is power. Is people who have power, and they use their power, and they use their power to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And our system, more than any other, has been able to mitigate that power by a rule of law. We are a government of laws and not men. I know that sounds like a cliche, and yes, there are millions of exceptions to it, but by and large, more than any system ever in history, we have a system where it's the law that matters. And not always, but more often, and it is the rule of law, I think, is the greatest creation of liberal democracy.
All right. Do you, after doing your book first on Sandra Day O'Connor, do you have any opinion on lifetime appointments for Supreme Court justices and judges in general?
Well, I can see the drawbacks, of course, because there are all these stories of people, Justice Douglas, and everybody carry him out of there. People get up there, they don't want to leave because it's a lot of power and people get looked after and all that. So those stories give me pause of aging justices and we live in an age where medical science can keep you going forever. So that does give me some pause. On the other hand, I want to depoliticize the court as much as possible, and I kind of like its remoteness. I sort of like the idea of lifetime tenure and of keeping these people free. I'm not for expanding the court. I know that's one of the current ideas. I don't think that's such a great idea. My goal, however you get there, my goal is to preserve the independence of the judiciary so that it can perform this great function I was talking about earlier, preserving the rule of law. However we do that, that's the goal here. If retiring the justices earlier would help that, I'm for it. If not retiring them, I'm for it. But that's the question we have to ask. How are we going to preserve the rule of law?
202 is the area code, 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones and have a question for historian and journalist Evan Thomas. 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, if you can't get through on the phone lines, so we have about 40 minutes left in our show today. If you can't get through on the phone lines, you can get through via social media, and we've had some great emails and tweets coming in via social media, so that's a second avenue for you. And this is going to fit right into our conversation in the last 10 minutes or so. This is from Gary, and he emails in general, are you a proponent of the great man theory or that the times make the leader?
Yeah. This is one of these great eternal questions that historians have. As a biographer, I tend to be in that sort of great man. Just to take a step back, the great man theory of history, popularized, I guess, by Carlyle, I think, in the 19th century, was that great men, and they were men, not women, great men make history. And of course, ever since then, scholars have rightly said, hey, wait a second. Not great men, it's crop prices, it's disease, it's revolution, it's a million little things. It's the enslaved Americans rising up. It's everything but great men that make history. And so there has been this flip in the academy, certainly among academic people, that they have long since discarded the great man theory of history. Popular historians like me, we kind of go with the great man theory of history in this sense. There are lots of times in history where the personality and the character of a man or a woman, Justice O'Connor's case, do make a difference. It's not just about bread prices and the weather or social forces or rising seas or patterns of herding cows, all these things that the academics look like. It's not that. It is the personality of the person in the chair who had the power, who made the decision to integrate the schools or to declare war or to do this or to do that. So personality does make a difference. Character does make a difference. So in that sense, but the true answer is it's all the above. It's all the above. Sometimes it is the person, sometimes it is some inchoate broad social force.
Many people have come to office, Congress, presidency, and wanted to drain the so-called swamp. Is it drainable?
No, of course not. I mean, I don't mean to be flip about this because reform...
And you are a Washingtonian.
Yeah. And look, I'm all for reform and reformers, and I think there have been great eras in American history where that drain the swamp notion rose up, and it was really important. Now let's take... the 1880s, 1890s, it was too easy for big money to buy congressmen. A railroad could buy a senator. And so they put in bribery laws, They tried to drain the swamp. They enforced Teddy Roosevelt enforcing antitrust action. The progressive era, where they did a lot to try to make government cleaner. Did it succeed? Partly, for time. And then, things backslide, and you got to do it again. That's American history, cycles of history, where you come in, you try to clean things up, you have partial success, never total success, because venial motivations never go away. But, you can have partial success, And that's important because you got to try. If we just gave up and said, oh, forget it, Washington's corrupt, people are evil, let it be. Well, that wouldn't work either because it would get a lot more corrupt. If you think it's corrupt now, get rid of a free press, get rid of reform movements, you'll see a real corruption. Every country in the history of the world that did not have a free press had tremendous corruption of power, corruption of money. So even as distasteful as the press can be, and it can be pretty distasteful, it performs this important function. It's this impetus to drain the swamp, either from the press as one source, but it can be political movements. That's an important movement. It's not going to work, and not going to work in a kind of pure sense, but it's important not to be too disappointed when it doesn't work, or to give, I give up, it's hopeless. No, it isn't. It's not hopeless. You have to be engaged, civically engaged, locally, state, be engaged, keep working at it, keep trying. Over time, great things do happen. In our country's history, sometimes over a very long time, it took 100 years to free the slaves, way too long. It took another 100 years before African Americans in this country were given the rights that they deserved or are entitled to. So, man, you have to wait generations sometimes, and it's galling and kind of outrageous. But as Martin Luther King liked to say, the arc of history does bend towards justice. Things do get better, maybe very slowly, but I have a Whig theory of history, what they call the Whig theory of history, which is that it does get better. Slowly, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it does get better.
But not on its own.
No, it takes people to do it. And again, back to your question of it's not just inertial forces, it takes human beings, sometimes very brave human beings. John Meacham has written a wonderful book about this, about going back, looking at periods in our history that look really bad, and this goes to this great man theory of history question. Times in history that really look bad, but where a president, typically a president, was able to do very brave things on civil rights, famously, but in other areas as well. When things look really dark, one man or one woman was able to make a difference. And that's the history of our country.
Let's go back to your favorite books, because we looked at 3 of them that you sent us. We discussed those 3. We didn't look at the 4th one, and this is a book by John Urschel and a woman named Louisa Thomas.
Louisa Thomas would happen to be my daughter. John Urschel, my daughter is married to a fellow named John Urschel, is a really fascinating guy. He was a professional football player, NFL football player, a lineman for the Baltimore Ravens. He played for 3 years in the NFL. He was mostly a backup lineman, but he started, at the end of the season, he would start 4 or 5 games a season. I think he started like 13 games, something like that. So he's a real football player, but at the same time, he is getting his PhD in mathematics at MIT. He's a 4th-year student now. He'll get his PhD, his doctorate next year. He's a math genius. A certified math genius. Pretty unusual combination. And so he's written a book with my daughter, Louisa, called Mind and Matter. And it's 2 stories. It's his discovery of math and his life in football. It's actually alternating chapters, math and football, math and football. And there's a commonality because it's his fascination with these things and why he was drawn to them and how he managed to do both of them at once, which seems, there were a couple of years when he was playing in the NFL and going to MIT and getting his doctorate. I don't know quite how he did that, but he did. And it's a great story.
And we're going to ask the producer on this one as well, did we cover Mind and Matter? In case people want to see it, because I can't remember if we covered it or not.
It's just out. The book is just out.
It is just out.
I don't think you did. He's gotten a lot of publicity.
Okay.
But I don't. Right. The book is just out.
Well, we will certainly look at it. Bob in Oklahoma City, thanks for holding. You're on with author and historian Evan Thomas.
Yes, good afternoon. First, let me say how much I really enjoy Book TV, how much I enjoy his books and listening to him speak. And along those lines, I was wondering if he had any thoughts on the passing of Tony Horwitz this past week.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I knew Tony Horwitz a little bit. A wonderful man, just full of life and very unusual approach to history, actually going there. You know, there's an expression that journalists sometimes use about walking the battlefield, going to the place where it happened. And Tony Horowitz really did that. I mean, I think he went into the Pacific, didn't he? I think he wrote a book about following Admiral, I guess it was Cook, maybe, through the Pacific. He went down into the South. His most recent book is going down, his most recent book, which is just out, if I remember this right, he's following Olmsted.
Yes,
Olmsted,
Central Park, who
weirdly,
was a New York Times
we think of Olmsted
correspondent.
as the architect, the landscape architect, Central Park, but actually, before he was that, he was a New York Times correspondent going into the South pre-Civil War as kind of a spy. I think spy is a fair word. And so what Tony Horowitz did was to retrace those steps and get to know the people in ways that journalists often don't. You know, one of the raps against journalists is that we kind of sit up in our palaces in New York and, you know, just talk to each other. And Tony Horowitz was that journalist / historian who actually went and talked to the people. And God love him for that. And I could see why. I knew him well enough to know he had this tremendous personal warmth and curiosity and non-judgmental kind of warmth. He's smart as heck himself, but he could talk to anybody and did. And in a way that didn't judge, that was warm, that was smart. Just such a tragic loss. Oh my God!
And it happened right here in Washington too.
He was about to appear in Politics and Prose, if I remember this right.
Yes, at the bookstore here. Yeah.
He was just walking around Bethesda. His wife Geraldine Brooks is a great writer. Oh my God!
She's Pulitzer Prize winner.
Yeah, she writes historical fiction, and I love her books.
And Tony Horowitz was at the Carter Center in Atlanta the week prior to his untimely death. Book TV covered him there. We aired it this weekend, so if you want to see one of Mr. Horowitz's last appearances talking about his newest book on Frederick Law Olmsted, you can go to booktv.org. You can type in his name, HORWITZ, and you'll be able to watch it there online. Geraldine Brooks, when she was on Book TV, told us that she had finally resigned herself to going to Antietam battlefield with her husband, and she would actually she had been there countless times and would finally get out of the car and you know, go on his tour with him.
I bet it was great.
Yeah. Randy's in Slaughter, Louisiana. Randy, go ahead with your question or comment for Evan Thomas.
Yes, I just want to make a comment. I think Richard Nixon did quite well when he the visit with Nikita Khrushchev in 1959. He handled that quite well. Thank you.
He did. This was a famous scene where they had a debate, I think, in a model kitchen over a stove or a washing machine. There was a Western exhibit of Western kitchenware, and Nixon was there on a trade mission. But he confronted Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union, and they debated the Cold War, and it really helped Nixon's political position because Americans could see him as a forceful guy who could stand up to the communists. I think he was on the cover of Time and Life at the time. It was an important moment for him in that weird, highly charged period of the mid-Cold War, 1959, when the Soviets were our great enemies. And the important thing was that see, an American and the Soviet leader actually talked to each other. I mean, actually talked to each other. That didn't happen in the 1950s. We were in our separate camps. But to bring them together, face to face, even though it was a contentious conversation, at least they were talking.
Well, your father at HarperCollins, or at Harper at the time, did something very unusual for the day. He gave somebody $1 million advance for a book.
You know, I'd forgotten that. Who got the advance?
Stalin's daughter.
Oh, yeah. He didn't. My dad was the #2 guy, I think. Okay. I don't think he wrote that check. I think that was Cass Canfield.
That was a huge amount of money at the
time. He was
the
editor of the book. I'd forgotten that. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Patricia McMillan, who I just saw recently, was a translator. And believe it or not, I was the first American boy Stalin's daughter ever met. She had just gotten off the plane. And I was a 16-year-old boy on my way back to boarding school, and I went to Patricia McMillan's house in Long Island, and Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, grabbed me pinched me by the cheek and said, American boy chick. Pinch my cheek. And but I'd forgotten that they paid her that much money.
Did Harper's earn its money back on that book?
I doubt it. I doubt it. $1 million was a heck of a lot of money back in the 1960s. I don't know. I'm guessing that they didn't, but I don't know.
William's in Goleta, California, or Coletta, California. Hi, William.
Good morning. How are you? My question is about the problem with my observations about these historians I see on cable stations, and it seems that they almost they morph into celebrity. They fly too close to the sun and become a celebrity instead of historians. They lose their perspective. I won't mention any names. You're probably friends with these people, but I see them on CNN and ESPN and MSNBC, and they morph into something else. They become celebrities, but they're historians first, then they become celebrities. What do you think about this now? They lose their perspective, I feel.
Thank you, William.
They become very
Thank you. We got it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a contentious issue that's evolved over time. I can remember when I was starting out in journalism, the New York Times did not want their journalists to go on TV. In fact, there's, I think, a rule against it. And if I remember this right, the great Hedrick Smith, who was their national political correspondent, he was forced to make a choice, either the Times or going on TV. And of course, that's all changed because
Steve Roberts did the same thing, Cokie Roberts' husband.
Okay, so it was a different era. So then as time went on and cable comes into existence, then newspapers change their mind in magazines and they want you to go on TV because it's a way of getting the story out and it's good for business and it's good for the egos of the people doing it. And journalists now get paid. Some of them have contracts with MSNBC or CNN or Fox or whatever, have contracts. And so, and their publications are for it. Now, I just read the other day, the Times is maybe pulling back. If I remember this right, I saw a story within the last 2 days that the New York Times stopped somebody from going on Rachel Maddow.
Was it Ms. Weiss?
I'm going to outrun my supply lines here. I apologize.
I agree.
But my only point is these pendulums swing. And it is a little bit of a complicated question because the old idea was journalists are so objective that they wouldn't give their opinions. You go on TV and you start giving your opinions and you are violating the old journalistic. Now, as journalism changed, it became less self-consciously objective and more analytical, and analysis gets you towards opinion, and it all gets kind of messy, and I don't know what I think of all this. I used to be on Inside Washington, so I did this. For 20 years, I would go talk on a panel with some other journalists, and this was not a big deal. The show was not a huge success. It was fun to do.
But you've also appeared on all the cable channels.
Oh, sure.
You've certainly been on C-SPAN many times over the years as well.
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an issue. I think it's an issue to talk about, and I've been in newsrooms where they talked about it. I don't know exactly where I come out. The credibility, I guess, the credibility of the news organization is important, and if people don't believe you, that's not good. But going on TV doesn't make you unbelievable. It can make you more credible. If the journalists go on TV and they explain why they did X, Y, or Z, or what, that can actually add to the credibility of the story. Look, the New York Times itself has just started a new show called The Weekly, where it's an attempt to put their reporters in front of a camera to explain why they did what they did. I think that transparency is good for journalism. That's a positive thing. But I can see at the same time that if a journalist who's covering the White House got on a TV show and he started denouncing the president or whatever, that would make his editors a little bit uncomfortable. It's hard to have a hard, fast rule for these things, and I'm trying to think this through as we talk, because I'm really not sure what I believe about this.
Well, let's look back at the turn of the 19th, 20th century and the rivalry or the relationship between Teddy Roosevelt and William Randolph Hearst.
That would be a case in point. I wrote about this. Hearst made a lot of money by selling two things, sex and crime. And he realized he could make even more money by selling a third thing, war. So he actively wanted to get the United States into a war, the Spanish-American War. And he claimed, how do you like the Journal's War? Now, that's not really true, but he claimed it. Teddy Roosevelt also wanted to get us into war for rather different reasons, because he thought of American empire needed to grow. But they had a confluence, but they hated each other. I think that Roosevelt looked down on Hearst. Hearst felt patronized by Roosevelt, a little bit like Richard Nixon, actually, as you think about it. And so they didn't have a cozy relationship, to put it mildly. But, you know, this is a great country, and the press uses politicians, and politicians use the press, and I suppose Roosevelt and Hearst used each other.
Next call for Evan Thomas. Janice, Callicoon, New York. Janice, you have been very patient.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I have a question, a comment, and just by way of grounding, ordinarily I wouldn't introduce myself this way, but I am a former C-SPAN guest as an author and historian, and ironically, I co-anchored Watergate. So, which brings us to my questions regarding your comments about Nixon. I am a little bit concerned, honestly, Mr. Thomas, about the way you kind of use the phrase tribalism to be a little bit dismissive of some of the serious flaws, not only in the country, but in our understanding of what this country has historically done, is still doing. Nixon, by way of example, Nixon wasn't responsible for being the lead president on civil rights. If anybody, it would have been Johnson. But in truth, it was the people whose dead bodies were being washed up by the backlash of that Nixon helped fuel.
Hey, Janice, two things
strategy.
Very quickly. If you could turn off your TV, it's a little difficult to hear you and the TV at the same time. So just talk to Mr. Thomas without the TV in the background. And can you give an example of what you mean by the use of tribalism?
Well, earlier, Evan had said that essentially, you know, he knew it was a bit of tribalism, and in a way, what he was referring to, I can't be absolutely specific, but I will tell you that when I heard it in context, I said, oh, that's white male supremacy. You know, it's the old school, it's the so-called elites. It was in that context that it was mentioned.
Thank you for calling in. Let's see if Mr. Thomas has anything he'd like to add.
Well, if I sounded like I'm guilty of white supremacy, please, you know, that's not me. That's not what I'm saying. Nixon was not the lead force on civil rights. You're right about that. Lyndon Johnson did way more than Richard Nixon ever did. But Nixon is relegated to being considered to be a racist and a bad guy. And Nixon made some racist comments on those tapes. He did. And Nixon was not blameless in this area. My only point...
So did LBJ.
And so did LBJ. My only point is that Nixon did more than we realize in the cause of civil rights.
And you went back to his vice presidency to talk about that.
Yes, in the 50s he certainly did. And he was closer. Martin Luther King had a bit of a relationship with Nixon and a respectful relationship with him. In the 50s, Nixon was, I wouldn't say he was an activist for civil rights, but he was not unfriendly to the cause of civil rights. When he became president, he made sure that the schools in the South were integrated. And you can look at the statistics on this. When he came in, a tiny percentage of blacks were in integrated schools. Within a couple of years, a large percentage were. He really moved the numbers. That has been overlooked. And George Shultz talks about this, actually, as labor secretary who's involved in this. And so I think Nixon deserves some credit for that. When I use the word tribalism, I mean that there's a streak in American politics where people naturally want to be part of their own gang, their own group, and they look at their tribe as their group, and they look down or askance at the other, capital T, capital O, the other. The other can be white, or it can be black, or it can be, whatever color you want, or it can be this religion or that religion, but it's the other. I got my group, and there's that group, and we're not the same group. Now, sometimes there's some interesting mixing between these groups, but when I use the word tribalism, that's what I'm referring to. It's the fear of the other, it's looking down on the other, and building up your own group. We had hoped after the end of the Cold War that we were going to go to a new era that was beyond tribalism. That didn't happen. And I think in the United States today, there is a lot of tribalism.
And with the Nixon example you were using, we were talking mainly about the Eastern establishment, the so-called Eastern establishment here in this country.
And there was, I'm loosely using the word tribalism there. There was, Nixon regarded the establishment as this other group. And he was fearful of them, and he thought they looked down on him. And he was not wrong about that. He was not wrong about that. That group, the Eastern established press, looked down on Nixon. I worked for the Washington Post Company. Believe me, I was there. I know how they felt about Nixon.
Did you have that feeling inside you as well?
Yes. Yeah. I was condescending to Nixon, and I don't think that was right. I don't think that was right. One reason I wrote the book was to explore those feelings and understand that, and to try to understand that better. I'm guilty, I'm sure, of all sorts of assumptions, prejudices, whatever you want to call them, as is everyone. Every human being has these. They just go without saying. We may not like to admit it, but we all got them. And, as a journalist, I want to understand that better and get to the roots of it, and just as a person to understand it better. So that's my context for. I hope that's what if I miscommunicated that, I apologize. But that's what I'm trying to communicate.
Evan Thomas is currently reading a book by Pulitzer Prize winner Rick Atkinson.
I am. I just started listening to it on Audible. I'm not reading. I'm listening to it as I drive around, and I've just gotten through Lexington and Concord. Rick Atkinson is the great military historian. Oh my God.
His trilogy on World War II.
He can
Pulitzer.
really bring it, because he's a whole nother order. He's not just giving you military history. There's a kind of literary quality and a depth of vision and storytelling, and you are right there. And so he's just, as I was driving here this morning, I was marching back from Lexington and Concord with these beleaguered redcoats, British soldiers, as the Minutemen are taking pot shots at them. And I'm right there. I felt like I was marching down that road from Lexington back to Boston, taking cover and so I was literally in the thing of Rick Atkinson just a couple of hours ago. That's a gift that he has. I know I'm going to love this book. I'm early in it, but I know I'm going to love all 3 volumes.
Oh, did Rick read his own book, do you know?
He read a prologue or an introduction, but then he has a professional actor reading the rest.
Do you find yourself doing that more and more, especially when you're sitting in traffic, doing the Audible version?
My wife and I listen to a lot of books as we travel. Sure. My daughter sends us novels that she thinks we'll like, so we do some of that. I generally don't do nonfiction. I'm doing it in this case because Atkinson's so good. It's like fiction, It's so memorable, and so you're so immediate and gripping. But mostly we listen to nonfiction, a wide variety. Our daughter provides a lot, or we ask friends.
And this is Rick Atkinson's, the first in his trilogy on the Revolutionary War. Jason, Salem, Oregon, you're on with historian and journalist Evan Thomas.
Thank you for having me on today. I've enjoyed this program with Mr. Thomas. I have a couple of questions for you. A few moments ago, you were speaking about the meeting between President Nixon and Khrushchev in 1959 and how you felt it was sort of a groundbreaking meeting. It didn't happen. We kind of kept to ourselves. And I'm wondering if you see a certain correlation between what President Trump has done with meeting with Kim Jong-un. That's my first question. The second question would be, do you find yourself correlating things that happen today with certain experiences you have had in your long career, and maybe making conclusions about that?
Well, to answer both questions at once, there are always patterns. But there's some cliche. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. You know, there are some patterns, but you can overstate them, and it's a problem for people like me, journalists, historians, or historian journalists, whatever it is I am. You can overdo this. You can say, "Oh, I remember this is just like the Cuban Missile Crisis." Well, no, it's not. It's a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then other circumstances do change. To go to your first question, generally speaking, it's good when leaders meet. I believe that. But there's a whole school of thought that says it's also dangerous that a summit meeting that's not pre-baked, pre-cooked, rehearsed, where everything is worked out, can do more harm than good. They can get into areas that will cause trouble. And so there is particularly a State Department view that you want to have everything sort of pre-cooked. And that's sort of not President Trump is more of a wing it kind of guy. I am personally torn about this. I have a foot in both camps. I generally believe, as I said about Nixon and Khrushchev, it was a good thing that these leaders met. Now, that was an informal meeting. That was not pre-planned. That was almost an accident that happened, and that there was a TV camera there and all that. But I think it was a good thing. I also understand the view that negotiations can go south if if the leaders haven't clearly figured out what they're trying to do. Sometimes they can go south. And interesting, Reagan and Gorbachev at Reykjavik, almost ended nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't, but it was sort of an interesting moment in history, an interesting try. I think it was great that Nixon went to Moscow in 1972 and negotiated the first SALT treaty. That was a great thing. Now, in the current day, I don't know what to make of President Trump doing this. I would like to end the North Korean nuclear threat aimed at me. I would like to end that. How you do that is a hard problem. They're a closed society over there in North Korea. They're not really talking to us. And it's a problem that has defeated administration after administration after administration, have gotten nowhere. Now, Trump is trying his own thing here. He's being ridiculed in some camps for doing it. I don't know. The answer is I don't know what's going to work. I think it's a good thing to try. I hope it doesn't get out of control. I hope he doesn't make a mistake. Of course, I hope all those things. But listen, this is a hard problem, and I sort of feel you got to try everything.
Well, Evan Thomas, Eisenhower was dealing with the North Koreans. And you talk about that in Ike's Bluff. Have we, over the years, had a pretty sturdy back channel into North Korea?
No, we have not. We've had to go through when Ike's case, the story always was that he threatened to use nuclear weapons in North Korea to end the Korean War if the North Koreans and he sent that message through indirect diplomatic channels, really aimed at Moscow, and Beijing. They were backing North Korea in the war, so it was aimed at all three of those parties. There's a huge dispute among scholars of whether the message got through, what it really meant. We could go on for hours confusing everybody about all that. But that shows you the difficulty of this diplomacy. It's not easy. And Ike was, I think, a master at this, but even in his case, I'm not really sure what happened there and what worked. It's international diplomacy, especially when your nuclear weapons are involved, is at once critically important and really hard to do.
If you'll think about one of your favorite journalistic stories that you've covered over the last 40 to 45 years as we take this call from Rachel in Tucson. Hi, Rachel.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering, what does Mr. Thomas think about historians going on TV, voicing their opinions, and then wanting us to buy their books, hoping that they're giving us an objective opinion or read on the person they're writing about? Also, what influence did his grandfather have on him? I think Mr. Thomas was a young man. He must have known his grandfather was a socialist at the time.
I did.
And also, has he read Mark Levin's book, on freedom of the press. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Rachel, do you think it's improper for Mr. Thomas to be here taking calls and having a chat about his work and history and things like that?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay,
No.
okay.
I'm talking about when I ask
What's that, ma'am? We lost you.
when I ask about historians going on TV and voicing their opinion, particularly about Donald Trump, I'm meaning where they go on MSNBC, CNN, many other venues for people to see them. That's what I mean. No, I'm glad he's here. I love listening to him.
All right. Thank you so much for calling in, Rachel.
Well, look, I go on, when I publish a book, I go on any damn TV show that will have me because I want to sell the books. But she does put her finger on something that is a little tricky because you can get drawn into very politicized discussions. That's what cable TV is selling, is political argument. You know, if MSNBC, that's what they're doing. And so you can get drawn into those things. And it can make me, actually, to tell you the truth, make me uncomfortable. I'm on the book trying to sell the show. I'm kind of trying not to get drawn into that argument. For one thing, I don't know enough. I'm not a journalist anymore. I retired from Newsweek in 2010. That was 9 years ago. I'm not in the loop the way I used to be. And yeah, I read the paper and I try to stay informed, but my opinions now are about my books. They're not about Donald Trump. I mean, we were just talking about Donald Trump, and you could see I'm not sure what to think about Donald Trump.
Mark Levin's book, new book, have you read that?
I don't, but tell me what it's about.
And I apologize, we've covered it on Book TV, or we're about to cover it, and I can't think of the name offhand. I'm sure my producer will type that in very quickly so we can tell you that. The Unfree Press or something like that.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I just don't know it.
It's Mark Levin's new book, the radio talk show host. And your grandfather, any influence that your grandfather had on you?
Well, he didn't make me a socialist, you know. I'm not sure he wanted to. Really.
Was he kind of pardon me, was he the crazy uncle in the attic,
No.
in a sense, in any way,
no,
shape,
oh,
or
no,
form?
No, not the crazy
Okay.
uncle. No, absolutely not. If I've implied that, that's wrong.
No, you have not at all.
No, he was a wonderful grandfather. He was very, by the time
What did he do for a living?
This is humorous. He lived off, the great socialists lived off, I think, checks from his wife, whose grandfather had founded U.S. Trust Company. So his socialist career was supported by, I think, dividend checks from U.S. Trust Company, I think.
Guess you can afford to be a socialist.
He also sold some books. I mean, he had a little income. But I think that's where I don't think, they weren't rich. I don't mean to imply they were not rich. But they had a comfortable upper middle class life. And I think that's where the money come from. It's sort of ironic or amusing, I guess. My grandfather was a wonderful man to me as a little boy growing up. He was a loving grandfather.
What is that journalistic story in the next 30 seconds that you want to share with us?
Well, 9/11, I mean, it was just an unbelievable.
Were you here in D.C. at the time?
I saw I didn't see the plane hit the Pentagon, but I saw the orange fireball out my window. I overlooked the Potomac River, and it was a horrible, but to be a journalist, unbelievable time to be. And we produced like 3 magazines in 4 days or something, something like that. And we just worked around the clock, and it was incredibly vital and exciting. And I remember thinking, I was getting a little bored in journalism that summer. I remember thinking, I'm bored, and maybe I should teach. I wasn't bored after 9/11.
What's your next book?
It's about dropping the atomic bomb on Japan, a narrative. I'm still working, I'm early days, really working on it, but I'm really interested in this question of moral men doing things that were arguably not so moral. How does that work? What's that like? What's that like for them? So that's, from the American side, but also from the Japanese side.
Evan Thomas, for the last 2 hours, has been our guest on Book TV's In Depth. His most recent book, First, about Sandra Day O'Connor. We truly appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thanks. It was great to be here.